Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be taking a look and comparing the 2020 revision of the Hifiman Sundara and the Audeze LCD-1. Now, before we get on into today's review, I just have to give a big shout out to Bloom Audio for providing the Sundara for review. Bloom Audio is an online audio retailer that carries many different brands, and Andrew over there has sent me quite a few different things in the past. So I will link his store below if you want to check out the Sundara from him. And the LCD-1 was sent to me directly by Audeze, so big thanks to Audeze for letting me get a chance to check out the LCD-1. So I will link both of their stores below if you are interested in either of these headphones. Now, the Sundara and the LCD-1 are both planar headphones coming in at a very similar price point. The LCD-1 is coming in at about $400, whereas the Sundara here is coming in at about $350. It is down from its $500 price tag from the last time I have reviewed it. And I did previously review the Sundara, and my review of that is still up. But there has been a little bit of a revision done to it since my initial review of it. So I thought I would check it out again to see if it has improved at all. So today we will be comparing the two and seeing which one that you should buy. Now let's go ahead and start with the specs here real quick. The LCD-1 is using a 16 ohm planar magnetic driver with a sensitivity of 99 dB per milliwatt, a frequency response of 10 to 50,000 hertz, and a weight of 250 grams. Very, very light headphone, as we'll talk about here in just a second. Okay, so moving on into build. The Sundara build I've already covered, so we're just going to breeze by this quickly. The more modern Hifiman headband that I am not personally much of a fan of, although it does work better on the Sundara than it does on the Ananda, because there is no cup swivel whatsoever. The standard little click adjust mechanism here that still scratches the paint on this part right here. The kind of like mesh metal grills there, 3.5mm plugs. Hifiman's, I don't know whatever these are, Focus or whatever their new pad is, hybrid pad for the Sundara is. And basically metal build all around, but does kind of rattle a little bit. And then the suspension headband. So we've looked at this before. You pretty much know how the Sundara is. Now moving into the LCD-1. The LCD-1 is a fairly interesting headphone in terms of build. So first of all, it is incredibly light. 250 grams makes it the lightest modern planar headphone as far as I know. It dethrones the Mr. Speakers or Dan Clark Audio Ether 2 as the lightest modern planar. Now, to be fair, it's also much, much smaller than the Ether 2 is. And the LCD-1 all around is plastic, very plasticky build all around. And honestly, it feels really cheap. It certainly does not feel like a $400 headphone. It feels about maybe like a $100 headphone in terms of build. But that is the price that you pay to get a extremely light 250 gram planar headphone for this price point. And this is 10 grams lighter than the HD 600 series, like the 6XX here. So just keep that in mind. This thing is incredibly, incredibly light headphone. But yeah, it does feel kind of cheap and rattly all around. A little adjustment mechanism right there that just slides, and it also does fold because this headphone is meant to be used portably. And just pleather pads, pleather headband cushion, but basically just a very plasticky build on the LCD-1. Now in terms of cables, the Sundara cable is complete garbage, as pretty much all Hifiman cables are, so I didn't even bother putting it on the table, just replace it. The LCD-1 cable is not bad. It is a dual entry 3.5mm, which curiously does not have a designated L and R. It's wired where you can plug either one into either side, which is pretty cool actually. Comes with a 1/4-inch adapter. It's like a braided cable. It's a little stiff, but it's not too bad. So not the worst stock cable ever on the LCD-1. And the LCD-1 also comes with a little carrying case, being that it is a portable headphone. So they just slot in right in there, and you can stick your cable up top. And it's nice to have a little included carrying case with the LCD-1, and the Sundara has no such case or anything else noteworthy in the box. So now as for comfort, the Sundara I do find pretty comfortable. However, if it doesn't seal on your head, I could see that being a problem. But for me personally, I do find it quite a comfortable headphone overall. Decent amount of clamp, but not too bad. My ears do kind of touch the inside, but it doesn't hurt me really at all. I can wear these for hours without any problem. And this headband is pretty comfortable overall despite the lack of swivel. So good comfort on these overall. The LCD-1 I could see being a problem in comfort for some people because it has very, very small pads. It can almost be an on-ear for some people. However, it is an over-ear for me personally. And I could see your ears being pushed right up against here. But it's not as bad as like the old Audeze Sign was. But it is a small headphone all in all. You might get a hot spot on the top of your head, but I would find that hard to believe given how light it is. It really just does not put much pressure on the top of your head, and there is adequate cushioning right there. So I don't think you'll have many comfort problems with these as long as your ears fit in here comfortably, but I wouldn't be too worried about hot spots or anything on the top of my head. And then as for power requirements, the Sundara, despite its low impedance, is actually pretty hard to drive. It's fairly insensitive. So it does need a little bit of juice. It's not crazy or anything. Like any $100 amp is way more than enough power to drive these. But these require similar power to like what these like 300 ohm Sennheisers do in order to be driven pretty well. So just keep that in mind that this is not a super, super easy to drive headphone. Now the LCD-1 on the other hand is incredibly easy to drive. I was using this on the Apple USB-C dongle that plugged into my laptop, and I was using it like between 10 and 20% on that thing, which is nothing. This thing takes no power, and I listen pretty loud. I'm on like the 80 to 90 dB spectrum of listeners, so yeah, this thing takes literally no power to drive. It is incredibly, incredibly easy to drive. Low impedance, really efficient. Takes nothing to drive. Any phone, laptop, onboard will drive this more than sufficiently. It is incredibly, incredibly easy to drive. Okay, so now let's move on into the sound of these two headphones. So starting off with the Sundara 2020 here. So the Sundara 2020 fixed pretty much what was my biggest complaint about the frequency response of the original, like the 2018, 2019 early, I guess, because I think the revision did happen late 2019, but I'm just going to call this the 2020 revision Sundara just to make it easier to understand here. So the bass does extend better. It is not quite perfectly flat all the way to 20. It seems to roll off a couple dB, maybe below 40. But it is much improved over the roll off of the old one, which was not much better than like the HD650. It was marginally better, but not massively better than that. After that, pretty much your bone typical Hifiman U-shaped tuning. Fairly flat until 1K, a little bit of jaggies there in your lower mid-range, a couple weird little dips like 5 and 800 hertz, which pretty typical Hifiman sawtooth mids. And then you have that just kind of U-shaped dip starting at about 1K. So you're like 1, 2, 3, 4K is a little bit recessed, just a couple dB. And then your treble comes back up in your like 8, 9, 10K region and is slightly elevated. And this is pretty much the typical Hifiman signature all around. So more or less flat bass and lower mids, and then your upper mids and the lower bit of your treble is a little bit recessed, and then your upper treble is slightly elevated. So all in all, very typical Hifiman signature on the Sundara. Now moving into the LCD-1. Now this is not tuned like the big LCDs, and that is actually a good thing in my opinion. So the LCD-1, the bass is not flat all the way to 20. It does have a little bit of roll off below like 40 or 50 hertz. It rolls off a couple dB. And on the measurements, it actually almost looks like Stax Lambda bass. It has that weird little just like shelf down a couple dB. But it does seem to slightly roll off, but it does get to 20 despite shelving down a little bit. After that, your mids are pretty much flat to 1K, and then it does start to recess a little bit. This thing, to me, signature actually reminds me a lot of the Hifiman Ananda. It has kind of a little bit more similar to that Hifiman U-shaped mids, but the treble doesn't come back up at the very end like it does on most Hifimans, which the Ananda didn't either. The Ananda kind of lacked that very, very upper treble that like the Aria has, the Sundara has, the HE1000 has. And this is also very similar. So also kind of another U-shaped mid-range signature, but the treble also comes down a little bit. It's not super dark or anything, but it doesn't come back up in line with where the lower mids were. So this is also kind of a Hifiman mid signature again, but without that upper treble right there. Okay, so now let's talk technicalities and other things here. So starting off with detail. The Sundara has really good detail for $350. It is definitely probably the class leader overall in detail for the sub $500 price point if we don't go with used market stuff here. I could see the argument being made that it's not necessarily more detailed than the 650, but it does depend on your definition of detail. But it certainly is right there at the top with the 660 and the 300 ohm Sennheisers and all those things. So no problem there. Really good detail overall. It's very resolving. Now, in terms of dynamics, I know a lot of people said that this thing got much punchier than the old version, which I complained about, that it was kind of compressed sounding overall. It may have improved a little bit, but I do wonder how much of it is really just because it extends better rather than it being actually dynamic. It is punchier than the older revision was, but I still don't find it like excessively punchy or anything. Like, it's not the punchiest planar I've ever heard. It's not an LCD-2 or anything like that, but it certainly is an improvement all in all. So I guess I'll give it to them there. It has improved in terms of its overall I guess slam in that case. But then in terms of micro and macro dynamics, overall, I'd say about average. It's not the most dynamic thing ever. It still has a little bit of that planar compression, but it does seem more dynamic overall, I guess, than the old revision of it was. Soundstage all in all is fairly decent. It's not incredibly wide, but it's not narrow like the 6XX or anything. It's a fairly, I'd say, average to maybe slightly above average soundstage. Timbre all in all is a bit plasticky, which is about to be expected given it's a planar of a fairly cheap price point and the signature, so a little bit plasticky there. And imaging is actually pretty good. It images very well. It's not 3-blob or anything, and it has pretty good imaging for its price point. And I believe that's all we have to talk about on the Sundara. Now, in terms of the LCD-1, this thing is not particularly dynamic overall. We'll start with dynamics on this one. So it's not the most dynamic thing ever. I'd say it's less dynamic overall than the Sundara. It doesn't slam as hard, but it's also not as good in the little microdynamics, and it's not overall as macrodynamic as the Sundara is. Sounds a little bit more compressed overall. Now, detail on this thing is actually pretty good given what it is. Now, I don't think it's as detailed as the Sundara, and I don't think it's as detailed as the 6XX necessarily, but that's under certain situations, which we'll talk about in the comparison to the 6XX at the end. But the detail overall is pretty good given that it's a portable headphone and a portable planar. I'd say it's competitive at least for its price point. Like, it's not massively behind or anything, but it's not a like top tier headphone in terms of detail. Timbre overall is still plasticky, is about to be expected, but I find it a little bit less plasticky than the Sundara is. And tonally, it's actually pretty good. It has a very nice tonality overall, which is surprising from an Audeze. And I think even tonally, it's a little bit better than the Sundara is, at least in my opinion. Soundstage is actually really small. I don't think it's particularly wider than the HT6XX is. I think it's a fairly narrow stage overall, and imaging is also average to slightly below average. I don't think it images particularly well either, but all in all, it does sound fairly good, but it does have some areas for improvement. So down to other comparisons here in my final thoughts. So if you're going to say which one of these should I take, it really depends on what you value. If you're going to sit down just right at your desk and you just want an open back headphone for your desk, I would probably just take the Sundara. I think it is a little bit more technically proficient all in all compared to the LCD-1. It's more comfortable. It's going to fit people's heads better. And all in all, I think the Sundara is a much better headphone than it was. And I think it's a fairly competitive headphone now at its price point, and it sounds pretty good overall. It's much more reminiscent of a higher end Hifiman in terms of signature, and now the bass extends more or less. So Sundara overall is not too bad at all, and I do like it quite a bit, and I do think it will get my recommendation for its price point for certain people, because you have to like the signature. Now the LCD-1, a lot of people have been comparing it to the HD 6XX or 600 or whatever, this 300 ohms Sennheiser models. So this is my stance on this versus the 6XX or here. The 6XX is still better tonality overall, and detail is going to depend. So I think that the LCD-1 has better detail at base. So if you're like powered off a really low end source like a phone or maybe a really cheap amp, I think the LCD-1 is going to give you better detail initially off of that. But I think that the 6XX has more room for improvement in scaling. So where if you have a higher end setup, which I mean, when in this case higher end, even like I think like a shit stack or something like that, I think then the 6XX is definitely more detailed than the LCD-1 and will beat it out technically in most areas. But on the low end of source gear, I think the LCD-1 has like a lower barrier to entry to get a good amount of detail. Now the LCD-1, you definitely do have to value the portability of it. Now it is a open back. I wish this was a closed back. If this was a closed back headphone with this sound and this foldability at this price, that's pretty much like market changer. But it being an open back, you really have to value that the portability and need a portable open back. If you need a portable open back, here you go. This is pretty much the one to take. It's not as a good tonality overall. It's technically fairly proficient. Build is a little bit iffy, but it sounds pretty good. But you just have to value the portability. And then as for the 6XX compared to the two of them, the 6XX is still the tonality and timbre king all in all. It just sounds really good. Or you can take a 600 or a 580 or any of those. The 6XX is just much cheaper than the two of them, and I think can compete in detail with the Sundara. So it depends on what you value. If you like the little bit wider stage and the bass extension and a little bit more treble, then yeah, you can definitely take the Sundara. But if you value tonality and overall timbre, then take the 6XX. And if you value portability a lot and want an incredibly easy to drive headphone that can run on anything and give you pretty good tonality, pretty decent detail, and is fairly comfortable as long as it fits your ears, then take the LCD-1. But really, you can't go wrong with either. Just depends on what you value and your personal preferences. But all three of them are good, and these are pretty much the three leaders here in their price class. But anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed my comparison of the LCD-1, the Sundara, and the HD 6XX. Links of where to buy these in the description below. Once again, thanks to Audeze for sending the LCD-1, and thanks to Bloom Audio for sending the Sundara for this review. I will link both of their stores below, as well as my Twitter, the ears graph, my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.